we live?
Good.
End stream.
All right.
Public?
Okay. So it is up and running now. All right.
Well, there's nobody there, no. Seems odd.
There we go. Yep, I see you. 62 people are there. So.
Okay.
All right.
Can I get out of the camera range? Hold on. And you're
Okay.
Yay!
We
that's
are here.
So nice. Yay!
We had, sorry, I'm a couple of minutes late. We had something about being private. Listen, I'm so delighted to be here today, live with you. Maybe you could just click in the chat and say where you are. I've got Robert Lee here who's helping me with the tech, and we've got all kinds of slides and things to show you. And I've got here. I'll just show you. We can go to the slideshow. We can go to my iPad, and I can draw something. There's that one. Anyway, so I've got lots of ideas and things to share with you today. And the thing that, and my wife, my lovely, beautiful wife is here. She's going to come and put it. She's going to be reading the chat. Here's Anne.
Oh.
She's going to be reading the chat. And here's the thing. I got so many questions. I have about 10 pages of notes, and I've tried to put graphics to each one as best I can. So it's not just me talking the whole time. But I got to the point Thursday evening, I realized I want to keep this to around an hour. I don't want to just keep going on forever. So if you're asking questions on the chat specifically about what I'm talking about, Anne may be able to catch that and tell me, and we can elaborate. But I wanted to try this live thing. You know, I mean, I talk with you in a way on video for a few minutes, and I make these videos, and I love making them, and I love the comments, and I love the connection. But the truth is, it's a little bit like wailing in the wilderness. I mean, there's nobody out there. So the idea, and I can see people arriving here, the idea that I can actually talk with you, we can't exactly have a conversation, but you can ask me questions. So I wanted to try this idea of going live as just as something that's possible, and we'll see how it goes. Because, you know, in a way, I kind of know a lot of you, not specifically, but having taught workshops for 25 years in smaller groups of a dozen people, 15 people, I know the demographic. And I know in a lot of cases, your desire in learning how to paint. Because it's usually it's like learning to play piano or something. It's not something you kind of have a couple of hacks and shortcuts and then all of a sudden you're painting great. It's something that really takes time and focus and attention. So there were 3 questions that came that I thought, rather than deal with them here, I'm going to deal with them in future videos because they're kind of bigger topics. One is someone asked about plein air easels. And I thought what I'd do is, like I had a studio tour here one week, I thought what I'd do is just do like a studio tour of plein air equipment, easels, and all that kind of thing, because I've done it for a long time and I've learned a lot. So I thought I'd devote a whole video one week to that. Another one was a number of questions about watercolor. And I just thought, rather than try to articulate that, I should just do a demonstration in watercolor too. Watercolor is not my main medium, but I know how to do it, and we can sort of talk about the principles, how what we're talking about here in terms of composition and the things we're talking about and watching it in oil paint actually translate pretty easily to watercolor. And the third was still life composition. And I thought, rather than try to talk about that in a lot of detail on a talk like this, again, I would make another video on it. As it happens, on March 2nd, 2021, which means that if you go to my YouTube channel and type in March 2nd, 2021, there's how to compose a still life there. And I think the week after is the demonstration of how I painted it. So that would sort of give you a start, and then I can do another one on that at another time. So Jane and Dave had 2 questions, and it was about notans. It's sort of the idea of notan. And here's the thing. Notan is actually a Japanese expression meaning black and white. And let me see, slideshow. So hopefully you're now seeing the slides. In a way, I've taken a photograph and I've reduced it, simplified it down to two values. A no-tan actually is a design in black and white. And I find, well, it isn't really much use. It's too far. It's gone too far in abstracting what's going on. It might work in some situations, but for the most part, probably not. And so, Robert, the slides aren't changing. Sorry.
Just a shout out to everybody. That's so cool where everyone is logging in from the end.
There, will it work? Ah, okay. So here's an example of a no-tan. We'll call it still a no-tan, but I just think of a sketch. This is still reduced from the photograph of 3 values. And you realize, oh, okay, that's telling me a lot more information. And there's a drawing of the same thing that has now gone to 4 values, right? That second mass there, that whole area on the far right, bottom right, is now a 4th value on there. And in 4 values, that is pretty much all you're going to need in order to translate that into whatever you're wanting to. You're going to understand a lot about it with 3 values and certainly 4 values. I think no-tan in terms of black and white is maybe too much. And, it might just be like, okay, we're calling maybe you're still calling this a no-tan. So here's that painting I did of that junkyard the other day. And, that in a way is sort of a no-tan of it. And I just don't think it gives you enough information. Let me see what's next on that. All right, I'm going back to there and back to me. So I think in a lot of ways, that whole idea of sketching before you begin is how much information can you gather. I was just watching this wonderful talk at the Royal Drawing Society, Royal Drawing School, the other day, a woman named Carolyn Walker. She's a wonderful painter, young, like 40. And she was just talking about drawing and how her hand understands and learns about what she's going to paint from the drawing process before she paints. And so I just think, so many of you say, how do you simplify and how do you get rid of detail? It's by changing it into 3 and 4 dimensions and figuring that out beforehand. And then, you stand such a better chance of following that when you begin to paint. Now, Cameron and several other people, actually, most of the first questions are because a bunch of people gave it a thumbs up. Cameron asked me, why am I not covered in paint when I do the demonstrations? And I wanted to find a picture of Soroy and Sargent and people like that in their 3-piece suits when they painted, because you don't have to get covered in paint. And my experience really is that I don't ever get paint on myself when I've got the paint on the end of the brush, which is like, 8 inches from my hand, and putting it on the canvas. It's always away from me. The thing where it happens is where you put a brush down and it rolls into your palette and you didn't notice, and you pick it up and then you've just got paint here, right? Or you put your sleeve into it when you're doing something, or when you open a tube and there's a big glob of paint and you didn't notice it. But for the most part, once I'm actually painting, the paint is on the end of the brush, not on my hands. But that brings me back to the idea, because there was a discussion of, I can't remember when it was, but people were saying how they keep their paint fresh. Now there is what happens when I scrape my palette. I use a lot of paint. And I scrape it, and there's a ton of paint. I must have been away for a week that I would have scraped it all like that. But the palette knife gives you a sense of how much that is. If I'm painting 2-3 times a week, it doesn't really matter. It doesn't really matter to me because it doesn't dry out. But if I were only painting on the weekend, say, then the idea of putting it in a freezer, a number of people were saying, oh, I put my thing in the freezer. I've never done it, but I'm sure it sounds like it works. And if you're just painting on the weekends, why waste that much paint? But I just take that as the cost of doing business, really. It doesn't really bother me that much. Now, Miki, hope I got your name right, and Adrian, they were asking about brushwork, technique. How do you make brushwork brush? And the first thing to remember is that brushwork is that you're drawing with a brush. So if you go here, let me just go back to slideshow. If you go to a drawing like that, look at every angle, like the pavement, the grass, the sidewalk, the bush, the tree. Do you see how the line is actually following the direction of the thing you're painting or drawing? Well, I would just say that's what drawing helps you do. And then when you come to paint, do exactly the same thing. So you see, the lines are kind of following the direction. If it goes in a little lump over that grass in the foreground, you do that. So this is a painting by Soroya. And just look at, like in the bush on the left-hand side, look at the direction of the marks. They're going vertically and curving as it curves. The things in the trees are sort of, because they're leaves, going around in different directions. But you can see he's sort of following the form with the brush. But the other thing is, when you're painting, the thing is, you need to, I keep going to the drawing pad instead of me. When you're painting, I would say, and you see this when I'm doing a demonstration, you'll often see a mark of paint there that I've put up there to test, right? You can't just mix something up on your palette and put it up on your canvas and expect it to be the right color. You test it, and if you've got the color and you've got enough over here, and then you just put it down. And you put it down in the direction the thing is. If it's a pavement, like this. If it's a tree, maybe like that. And then leave it. If it's completely wrong, you see the color's wrong, or the shape is terrible, well, you could scrape it back maybe. And then again, you find the right color, you test it, and you put it down. I mean, it's lovely to think, and if you watch, I don't know if we were watching Soroya paint or Sargent paint, you'd see these colors coming magically off their palette and onto their painting, and it just seemed like perfect every time. But that is long experience that gets them there. The rest of it is that it's lovely to have this idea that I want to be free and just paint, but it all adds up to a series of things, shapes of the right color, that when you get them right, the landscape, the figure, so on, takes care of itself. So it really does mean making sure you get the color right, put it down, and leave it. So you're not overworking it. Because, someone was asking, and I'll get to it later, about, just mushing the edges and blending and so on like that. I'll get to that later. So Richard asked a question about what kind of drawing do I do before beginning to paint? Because I've used words like thumbnails, sketches, drawings, roadmaps, and so on like that. So I thought what I'd do is give you a series of ideas of what they all mean, because you don't have to do all of them, obviously. So there's a photograph I took when I was teaching a workshop. And the top drawing, I asked my students to do a thumbnail. I call it a thumbnail, before they begin. And they're starting to do that drawing. And I come up, and to my mind, it's plein air. This is too much information. And so I did one underneath it of the actual subject we were looking at. And that's a thumbnail. That gives you a pretty clear idea of the major shapes and where I want you to go, where the eye is going. You haven't got time necessarily in a plein air situation with the light changing to do a drawing like at the top. There's nothing wrong with spending that much time, but if you're trying to catch the light, you might not have the time. So there's sort of the idea of like a plein air thing in advance on a sheet of paper 4 inches by 3 inches before beginning. And there's another one, and there's the painting I did from it, right? So that's an actual plein air sketch, thumbnail done at the time, and there's the painting I did of it. So you can kind of see the role that it played in making me understand. You may think that I don't need it, but I've got a viewfinder. I'm trying to figure out where those 4 most important lines of the composition is, and then I put it to that. So there's another example. There's an image. I think I did a painting of that one week, and there's a drawing of it. That's what I want to do. That's maybe a little bit more. This was a studio painting, so it wasn't plein air, but it's just giving me a little bit more information before I begin. So there's an example of a thumbnail, and you can see how fluid both sides are, right? Even the top in a way, because I've come way down with this big mass of trees and decided to cut it right there. And both sides are pretty fluid. I'm going to go further out on the right-hand side. You see I've sort of expanded it out there. The left-hand side, maybe I'm going to start coming in a little bit and crop it a little tighter. But you can see how I understand where the shapes are, I understand where the center of interest is, and I've got it sort of orchestrated that way. Okay. So I'll go back to that one in a minute. So here is an interesting question. Kay Brooks and Craig were saying, what's the best way to mix different hues of the same value? So I wanted to show you again on a slideshow. There is orange and blue, and you would say that, oh, that orange down at the bottom, surrounded by the 2 blues, much lighter than the blue, much lighter than the blue, right? And you look at it and you think, God, I would have thought it was lighter than that. So I've just taken the same photograph and sucked all the color out of it. But here's the thing. Color is a complex problem, and it rests on 3 pillars: hue, value, and intensity. And the value of what you're painting, in many respects, is the most important thing, because you can turn almost any image black and white. You can still read it just fine, right? So it's really important that we get this idea of, okay, if I'm painting in color, have I got the values right? And the other one is intensity, but let's just not deal with intensity now, because that's a whole can of worms of its own. But let's just say you take, as an example, let's take 5 colors, and you paint 5 colors in 5 different hues, like red, blue, green, dull, not straight, just 5 colors like that. And then create a little box below it and try to match that color, change the hue, so the top is red, you go down to blue, try to find that blue in the same value for all those 5 colors. And then take a photograph of it and put it in your photo program and strip all the color away so it's black and white like that one I just showed you, and see how close were you. Now, you might say, that seems like, well, that's kind of time consuming, isn't it? But here's the thing. If you were a pianist and you were trying to learn this complex piece by Chopin, let's say, and you can play most of it, but there's this middle section of 20 seconds that's just like, God. Well, that would be the place, after you've warmed up, to go and practice. That's called deliberate practice. That guy, Dr. Erickson, who did that study, the 10,000 hours that Malcolm Gladwell talked about, the 10,000 hours was pretty much just Malcolm Gladwell's idea of creating a nice round figure. It isn't that 10,000 hours makes you a master. If you want to be a real master in violin, which is what they were studying, it'd be like 50,000 hours, right? To get into Carnegie Hall or something. But deliberate practice isn't just doing the same thing over and over and over again, like picking up a canvas every day and doing another one and doing another one. If you've got a certain weakness where you're seeing, I can't get that, deliberate practice means going in and finding a way to solve it, breaking it down, deconstructing the problem, and actually focusing on that through some exercises. Because if you're just painting, you've got so many things you're thinking about. That one thing of getting the values right, you might just not really be thinking about it at all because you're trying to get the shape of the tree right. So if you isolate a problem that you're having problems with, that is a really useful way to solve it. Just deconstruct it and find through deliberate practice, just spend a morning trying to find it. And then there was a question related to that about changing the values in composition in a painting. And here's the thing. You can change, of those three pillars, and temperature is a subset of them, right? You can find any color with hue, value, and intensity. All the different systems, Munsell system and all those other systems, find it with those three. Temperature is something we use experientially when we paint, and it's very useful. But you can exaggerate the value. You can push the value. Obviously, photographs often push the value because in many cases, the photograph just goes black in the shadows, right? And we still know what it is. The question is, do you want the shadows to have luminosity or do you want them to be a big dark shape? You can change the intensity because you've seen paintings where the intensity is much more exaggerated. And sometimes it looks terrific. Sometimes it just looks garish, depending on the way it's done. I would say the most flexible of all of them is hue. If you get the value and the intensity right, the hue, meaning it's red, green, blue, like that, it can shift around a little bit on the color wheel and no one will probably notice. You can use, you have a little bit of leniency there. I mean, as long as it looks good, it doesn't look odd. So now the other thing is David was asking me about toning canvases. So I've got two here. There's one just with a little yellow ochre and black and one that's just sort of got a burnt sienna, a panel. Now, when I'm working on smaller paintings, plein air or in the studio, I do a thin wash like that and tone it and let it dry. And the reason is that when I'm painting smaller, there'll be little places between brush strokes where I can see the canvas. And if it's white, afterward, when you take a photograph, the light may bounce off that and exaggerate those whites. And it's annoying because then you got to go back in and fill them up. So if you have a toned canvas like that, it just, when you're taking the picture afterward, and actually even when you're painting, you can have quite a large section of it there and you don't even notice it because it just sort of falls into the illusion. I'm not a big fan of toning canvases like bright alizarin and so on. I just find it like it's hard enough to find colors without trying to find colors next to bright alizarin. But that's just, my preference, I suppose. And Jacqueline had a question about the final varnish. Oh, so partly that on larger canvases in the studio, I paint a block in, and you've seen me do that often, right? And I paint the block in, all the white is gone. And so I don't tone it in advance because I'm just getting a fairly thin wash of color over the whole thing. And then I've been given a clue here. Do I want a quick 2-minute break? And I'm thinking, well, where are we going to go? I'm not sure. So I'm just going to keep going and hopefully you're enjoying it. But on larger canvases, I'm painting it so that those white things are no longer there because they're gone. And then I'm adding the paint to the second layer. And Jacqueline had a question about the final varnish. And usually what I do is I have a can of Damar varnish, pure Damar varnish. And if it's a panel like about this big, I'll just spray it nice and wide each side so you don't get it sort of doubling up on each side. Just like that, about that much, literally, on a canvas this big, and do it outside or do it inside and leave the room because it's really toxic. And that's it. It just sort of brings all the different colors up just a little bit as they sink in. As they dry, they kind of sink in. And then for large paintings, because in most cases there's a couple of layers of paint there, I tend to not varnish them. It's usually the paint has been painted, there's enough layers of paint there that it kind of has its own integrity. So Catherine had a question about which comes first, the armature or the shapes. And it's not really like chicken and the egg, but in a way. I mean, they're so embedded together. You may be out or looking at photographs or walking around something, and there may be an arrangement of shapes that really engage you, and the armature is created and embedded right within it at exactly the same time. Other times you may realize, oh, that's interesting, but I now need to get maybe some entrance into the painting. If I come around here, that's a little better. So the shapes have caught your attention, and then you're having to go and look for the structure. So in many ways, I'd say the first thing that grabs my attention is value shapes, big darks and lights. And then how do we orchestrate those big darks and lights into a compositional structure that's going to work? And as I've said before, sometimes, the edges of what we're looking at, right? The edges of what we're looking at, of the shapes, are caused by the value shifts. If you have something that are the same value, you have no edge. So you're seeing shapes in the landscape, let's say. You're seeing the shapes, and they're being created by value shifts. And those value shifts are also creating the structure, right? That's the vertical, that's the horizontal on the edge of this and this that is giving you the possibility of the structure. I'm going to leave that. So, and then Judy had a question about why big foregrounds. So I just want to look at something here. So there's a painting I did some time ago. And she was saying, as a photographer, I tend to come in closer. Like, she didn't have this one to look at, but I'm presuming, let's say, she would go further down the road and take a picture or walk over to the buildings because the buildings look interesting. But what I'm trying to do is create the whole sense of movement into space. I'm trying to carve depth into space when I paint. And so when I have, and this isn't just me, I mean, you'll see this all the time, lots of landscapes have big foregrounds, because if you just go to the end of the road and take the picture, it's sort of like it's just staring you straight in the face. Whereas now you get the sense that, oh, my feet are planted here on the road, and I have a sense of how far I'd have to walk to the turn in the road, and how far that turn of the road must be from that wall in the building, and I can see into the distance and so on. There was a quick sketch, I was noticing a quick sketch that I did wondering about, again, this is a studio painting, I wouldn't be doing this plein air, and then I did a more finished one to sort of get what I wanted to have happen in the mountains and so on before beginning to paint. So I hope that sort of answers that question, because it gives, go back to the drawing thing. It gives you that sense of how you're rolling into space. It gives you a sense of where things are sitting in space, and the foreground, in a way, is the lead-in to the midground, which is mainly what you want us to see, and then there's the background. So here, I'll just go back to that again. You can see the foreground is simple. Most of the complexity is in the midground, and the background is simple. And so that's why you want to have this sense of moving into space before you're sort of confronted by the thing you actually want us to look at. Here, I'm going to go to the drawing pad, because Joe and Linda had a question about the horizontal and the vertical. And they were saying, like, does the horizontal and the vertical need to go the full length, the full thing, like it's a telephone pole or something? And no. Let's just say, for example, you've got something and you're sort of saying that I want us to come. So there's maybe the road map I've created before I begin to paint. I want us to come in here, and there's a little town here. And this is a mountain. So that's the foundation of it. And you can see that this and this leading to here gives us the structure. The value contrast between the sky and the mountain, the value contrast might be very small. The road might be a little lighter maybe, but it'll just be enough to lead us to, we'll do something there to sort of hold the attention. But you can see that having created that, You could create a drawing that does all kinds of things. But it doesn't change the basic structure, right? It's all just detail added to the basic structure. And I wanted to show you two examples. This is Sisley, Impressionist, sort of 1860 or something. But look at his structure here. This coming down to here, this, and this, and this leading to here. That's not an accident. That's what he intended. Oops. Don't want that there just yet. The other thing is look at this. Look at this shape here. Follow the way he's wanting us to go to here. Your eye will naturally do that, but look how it's distracted by how dark that is. Or the contrast, we could say, all the way around that thing, dark against light. Look at how it's distracting your eye. Now, it may have been that the paint has changed since then. Maybe he didn't notice. I don't know. But that's what can happen when you're pushing everything. You know, even if you've got a great compositional idea, if you get contrasts that are stronger than the one leading us here, it'll distract our attention. So let's look at a painting by Corot. How do I go to Corot here? I have to go here. This is a painting by Corot. So again, a lot of Corot's paintings, he has fairly large skies, but he has it gradated to push us in like that. And obviously you've got this, but you see how this breaks that, pulls us to here, brings us into there. I mean, there's a very specific contrast there and orchestration towards how he wants us to go and how he's orchestrating the composition. So,
Do you want some questions?
other questions?
Yes, there's so many questions.
There's masses of questions. So, yes, question.
Okay, so a couple really interesting questions. Anne Delmar asked,
And Delmore.
why you paint outdoors? And then just as a follow-up to that, Mary Phillips just asked, is it a good idea to do a monochrome underpainting and no tan prior to adding color even while painting?
Two great questions. So, and who? And
Delmar.
Al Delmar. So why do I paint outdoors? Here's the thing is, you've had that experience. I know you go outdoors on a beautiful day, the sun's shining, the birds are singing, there's bees in the flowers, there's water in the stream, and you're just happy to be there. It's nice to be there. It's a good feeling to be there. And I would say there is probably no simpler explanation than why I'm pulled to paint outdoors. It's more complicated in some ways than painting in the studio. I mean, it could start to rain. A fog bank could come in and you can't paint anymore. I mean, there's lots of things that can go wrong. You might not find anything to paint. You're sort of wandering around feeling like, what the heck? But the truth is, I like being in nature and I like responding directly to it. And it keeps you really on your toes because it's changing quickly. If you're painting light, you don't really sit there noticing very often how quickly a shadow is moving until you're trying to paint a scene. And whoa, stop, slow down, wait. It changes things and you kind of have to hold a picture in your mind. So it's a fabulous way to connect to nature. I find it exhilarating. I mean, I find it exhilarating when it's going well. Obviously, if the painting's not going well, I'm not so exhilarated. And then Mary Phillips, and hi, Mary. What did Mary ask?
Hang on. it was about Notan.
Oh, yeah. Okay, so here's the thing. If you're working in the studio, if you go back to, I don't know, French salon paintings, right? Or if you go back Rubens or somebody like that. Rubens didn't do a grisaille. Grisaille is painting your whole thing in black and white first. Rubens sort of did a brown, brunei or something, but it would be a brown version of a grisaille. But the French word for gray is gris, so grisaille. So that was a very common practice in the sort of French salon period before Impressionism. And the reason is because they had very complicated subject matters, right? They were putting in all kinds of mythological stuff and symbols and things, and literary people would kind of read the paintings and figures. I'm going to show you a French salon painting in a minute. And you just get a sense of the refinement and the ability. But they're very complicated. And so to just head straight in with color, they just said, too complicated. We're going to paint the whole thing in black and white first, then we're going to add color to that. Because we know black and white's working, we'll add the color, it'll just improve it. So, Mary, in most cases, if you've sketched the thing out, reasonably well, and you're pretty sure that you've got a good handle on it, then, at least for me, I would pretty much just head straight into painting it. But if I were doing a big painting, let's say I was doing something 5 feet by 6 feet or something, and I was really like, okay, I got to make sure this is working before I might do sort of just wash in the big masses in value before beginning. But for most paintings of this sort of size, if I've figured it out mentally and having drawn it and figured it out, I would just head straight into painting.
Okay, two more questions
Okay.
right along those lines.
Okay.
Arjit had a question relative to that. How do I translate the same gray values into the equivalent of green?
Well, this was the thing that I was saying about you're looking at a landscape. You obviously have to, each color shape you're looking at there has to have a value, and it's got a color too, but it has to have a value embedded in that color. And because the color is like the most, it's green, it's getting all the attention, it's hard to separate out the value. So I would say, just as an example, find a photograph with maybe half a dozen greens in it, like the light's hitting a half a dozen different kinds of trees with different greens, and paint it as best you can, trying to match it for color. And of course, that means for value, right? Because the value is embedded. And then take a photograph of it, make it black and white, and see, how well did I do? Where did I go wrong? Because it's only in the flat out experience of it that you'll really understand how to do it. And I'll give you an example. When I was at art college, I did a year of color theory. It was Joseph Albers, what's his name?
Albers, right?
Anyway, Johannes Itten. Johannes Itten's book. It was sort of based on the Bauhaus. And we did color theory from that book for a whole year. Experiment over experiment over experiment. And I remember painting one time, late evening light, just everything just bathed in orange. And these trees, this is exactly to your point about value, but it's a question about practice, theory and practice. And I'm looking at these trees, and after a year of color theory, I'm looking at it and I have no idea how to paint it because it's green, and yet it's obviously orange. And I didn't know how to mix it. I was just confused. In the end, I just thought, I just gotta put it together, see what happens. And it was perfect. It was like such an astonishing experience because I'd learnt it from my own practice, and the theory didn't help me at all. So in some ways, just isolating those places where you have problems and saying, okay, I'm going to practice that. And I'll just try it a couple of times. I'll see where I'm going wrong, and then do it a couple of times and give it a try.
Okay, one more question.
I'm just going to go on here to our list, and then we'll do that.
Okay.
Now, Julie asked a question about reference photos. And next week's video is exactly on that, how I find reference photos. Because Ann and I went up the coast and I took about 350 photos, and I'm just going to show you the editing process. I certainly don't show you 350 photos, but they can kind of be grouped into things, and then I do 6 drawings of ones that I think are interesting. And you'll see that out of 350 photographs, I don't get very many that I'm really excited to paint. But Diane asked the question, but we'll talk about that next week. And the other thing is, I don't get that many, but I'm happy again to be out in nature taking the pictures. It's not like, oh, this is all painful because I'm only getting one painting or out of this whole group. And Diane asked about taking, using 2 or 3 photographs in any given painting. And I have to say, I don't think I ever do it. The only place where I could see it being really useful is to take 2 photographs of exactly the same things at different exposures, so that perhaps when you take it in the light, all the shadows are too dark. So then you take it for the dark and it fills in the darks, and then the lights are bleached out. But that way you've got the information, either because the photograph is too light in the lights or too dark in the darks. You've got 2 photograph reference of exactly the same thing. But the idea of 2 or 3 photographs and trying to piece it together, I'm not saying it can't be done. I just never look at it as something that I would particularly want to do. And then Ramesh and Julie were asking about warm and cool harmony and the right shadow color for each. And how do you do that? So that's how you do it. Now, this is a photograph. And again, looking at that photograph, the shadows are too dark. Your eye would find more color in those shadows. Photographs are just not as sensitive as your eye is. But imagine putting, say, a pale green. I have those blocks. They're just outside. Imagine putting a pale green piece of paper, construction paper, and putting those different blocks on it, and having shadows, lit side and dark side of the green paper as well. And you could paint, after doing them in pure primaries, you could dull them down a little bit so that they're lower intensity, yellow, red, and blue. Other colors, and just put them in the sunlight, lit side, dark side, lit side, dark side. Again, it's this idea of deliberate practice. If you're having trouble with something, go and focus on it, because it's not going to get better when you're trying to do the 10,000 things that have to happen when you're making a painting. I mean, I do these sketches in advance because I know how much can come up in the painting process that I was never thinking about. And if I've got things sort of on a roadmap going where I think it's going to go, I can take them in stride. If I don't really know where I'm going and they also hit me, it can just sort of overwhelm the whole process in a way. Now, Stephen had a question about atmospheric perspective. And it was a really good one in the sense that he said, and I'm not sure why, where he lives, the backgrounds are all dark. They're all dark. Maybe there's big dark mountains around him or something. I'm not sure. But the thing is, there's 2 kinds of atmospheric perspective. One atmospheric perspective is the one that we get and we all know it, things get sort of paler and bluer as they go into the distance. So that's one. And that thing, we've seen it, we can paint it. The other is an artistic license. And that's the one that the moment we go past the part you want the viewer to look at, you start to exaggerate the simplicity. So the moment you go back just a little bit behind these trees that you want us to look at, I should be doing it this way. I can't figure out what to do. But the moment, sorry, I've got 2 cameras I'm looking at. So you're going in behind. These are the trees you want to look at, and in behind here, this is very, very simple. You keep it more simple. And if it goes back a little further, so let's say you've got the sense of sort of leaves and branches here. By the time you get back here, they'd just be shapes. By the time you get back here, simpler shapes with less value contrast. By the time you get back here, they're really blued out. So you manufacture how the viewer understands how far away it is. Even though you might be out in the landscape and those trees you're looking at are exactly the same as the ones you're looking at in the midground, you're manufacturing the atmospheric perspective through simplicity. That's the way to go with it. I can see all kinds of questions coming up here as they go by. And first off, it's lovely to be here with you. Really, it's so much fun. I mean, I'm obviously doing all the talking, but so related to that, CBET, and that's all I could get from it because he has written in Cyrillic. He was saying he tends to make the foreground too intense, and then by atmospheric perspective, it would then be bluer and paler as you go into the distance. Well, in fact, what you want to do is have the things we're looking at in the midground, the background, atmospheric perspective, either real or constructed, is taking this, this is moving further away. And the foreground, you don't want the most intense colors here. The foreground's only job is to pull you into the thing you want us to look at. So having your bright, intense colors in the foreground, even though in real life that might be the case looking around, that's going to be very distracting for us to actually quietly move into the midground where you want us to go. Have you got a question there?
Yeah. I think this is a really interesting question. Hua Zhang asked, can notan simply be considered a thumbnail with values included?
Well, that's it. It's the idea, can notans be considered thumbnails with values included? See, the thing is, if you're using the word notan specifically, as they say, it's a Japanese term for black and white, and that's, I don't think, much use to us. If you're going to include the word notan in the idea of roadmaps, thumbnails, and sketches, fine. I mean, they're all the same idea, and that we're using them as a way to understand what we want to do. The idea of notans, in a way, a thumbnail is sort of giving us more the structure. Notan is working more on the idea of the value masses and the arrangement of them and how they fit on the picture plane. A sketch, I would say, if we're going to start defining things, a sketch is maybe putting the two together. A sketch then would be something you might do in the studio. A notan you might do out on plein air, but I've only usually got time to do a thumbnail, just a few lines figuring out the structure. And hopefully my eye is telling me the big shapes are working. Andrea had a question about cropping and framing and framing, really. But her question is about standard sizes and custom sizes. And I've mentioned before that I generally have a few standard sizes, 8 by 10, 10 by 12. Then bigger ones would be 36 by 36 and 30 by 40. And I have frames for those sizes. How long have we been here? I have frames for those sizes. And so I'm going to show you, but let's just take an example of proportion. Most of the standard sizes you see, 8 by 10 and so on, like 3 by 4, that proportion gives us 6 by 8, 9 by 12, 12, 16, 16, 20, 18, 24, and so on. Generally speaking, 2 by 3, 4 by 5, 3 by 4, those are the sizes, those proportions are the sizes you'll normally find. If you go out and decide, no, this painting, it really needs to be 10 3/8 by a 14.5 to actually really do justice to the composition, then you're the one stuck with that frame, as I have been, pretty much till the end of time if you don't happen to sell it. So you can get stuck with a lot of odd-sized frames. And, you could say that, well, that's kind of cramping my creativity, isn't it? But imagine a Renaissance painter who's been commissioned to fill an altar space, exactly that size, 42 inches wide, 100 inches tall, and I want Mary and Jesus in it, and I want my patron saint, and I want me, and I want my kids. So that's the job. Well, that's cramping his creativity by a lot, but the paintings we remember from the Renaissance is where they actually took that limitation and made it work. So I don't think just sticking to a few standard sizes is necessarily the kiss of death. And then here I wanted a great question by Defan, who said he's a complete beginner. And where do I start so I'm not completely overwhelmed? And it's a great question because this is what happens when you're trying to do color and value and intensities and hue and shapes and drawing and brushwork. All together, it's a lot. So I had a thought for him, and it might be useful. This is the painter Wolf Kahn. Now, he's known as a colorist. You can see he's obviously exaggerating colors here. But my contention, of course, is that that painting works because of the values, not because that it has beautiful color. It's a good design. So my thought was, take a couple of Wolf Kahn paintings. I'm going to show you 2 or 3 right now. And paint them in black and white. Maybe turn them, take a photograph of one, get a book of his or something, see if you can get it online. Take a photograph, turn it black and white, and just do it in black and white. So there it is in black and white, and you can see, oh yeah, that painting works entirely in black and white. Beautiful in color, but you realize value's doing all the work, color gets all the attention. And so by stripping the color out and just doing it in black and white, and if you were to find maybe in 1 or 2 places that the values were getting so close you couldn't distinguish them, maybe you stretch them, but ever so slightly. So I'm not sure what happened there. I've got 2 of them on the screen at the same time. Oh, I guess that's the painting. It's 2 buildings. So I think I turned this one black and white too. Yeah. So again, you see, beautiful. Look at the color. Ooh, blue barns, all these different colors, crazy. And yet it works in black and white. They really hold together in black and white. And I think there's one more here. Yeah, this one I've never even seen in color, but I just love it. Also a Wolf Kahn. So imagine you could paint those in black and white, simplify the process. He's done the design for you. He's done the big value masses and so on. And you're just copying that in terms of simply getting a sense of some shapes, carving depth on the picture plate. And then Michael had a question about, he draws well, but jumping into color feels overwhelming. And again, here's something that you might try, is again, painting in black and white, just like this, and then add yellow ochre. Now, I added 1 piece of green to that, but that painting is done in titanium white, ivory black, and yellow ochre. And you can get a lot of information with just those 3, looking at color, temperature, and value, and so on. And if you can get that going, then on top of that, you can just sort of start adding color right where you want us to look, and then just sort of adding a little bit of color that, the background hill could have been a little bluer. And you might use a little ultramarine for that, and the foreground might have a little bit more green. But you can realize, having got this done, you could kind of pull out a way of stepping your way towards full color. And then,
Yes, lots
Julia.
of questions about brushes.
Okay, brushes.
How many, I'm just going to say, Aaron Hills just said, how many do you use in the course of a painting? Okay.
So there are my brushes. And somebody said to me, I can't remember the name, they're riggers, maybe? These brushes that have they have a kind of weird shape that go like this. They thought I was using riggers. These used to be like this. I just grind them. I'm hard on brushes, I can tell you. And here's the thing. I do most of the painting with brushes about this big until literally I can't fit the shape in anymore, and then I'll go to this, and then like this. There's maybe one size, a number 2 I've got that would go a little smaller than that. And for the most part, when I'm blocking in, getting the paint organized, I just keep using the same brush. If you've ever seen me do a demo live, I just keep using the same brush. I wouldn't say it's a good habit, but it's what I do. And I clean the brush out and start again, clean the brush out, start again. Now, if I'm starting to work with warms and cools or lights and darks that are dramatic, and so I'm going in with the darks, and now I want to go in with the lights, and then I'm going in with the darks again, well, then I'll start to use brushes, one for the warms and the cools, one for the warms and the cools, or one for the lights and the darks. So I'm not cleaning the brush all the way back and loading it up, and then all the way back. I've got the 2 going at the same time. The only other brush I use, well, I've got two others actually. The only other I use is sometimes I'll use something like that just for a piece of detail that I need to add, but not very often. And then there's these sort of rigger brushes. And someone was asking me about how do you put in like a telephone line? So these things, when they come to a point, this one's pretty worn out actually, but when they come to a point, the first thing is, someone else asked me, I'm trying to put in some blades of grass and I'm mixing up, I can't get enough paint on it, and then I need to put some solvent and then it's too thinned out. So here's what to do. If you're putting a bunch of thin lines in with a brush like this, mix the paint with this one, get a big mass of the color you need, and then drag this into it, so there's lots of paint in it, and then just go, and then get more paint in it, and go in like that. And
Do you work big brush to small brush?
big brush to small brush, pretty much always. Because small brush is starting to get to the idea that I'm articulating smaller shapes, and I want to make sure that I'm getting all the big shapes working before I work about littler shapes within those big shapes. So someone else was saying about this rigger, if you wanted to put in a telephone line, you get this really, you get a little bit of paint on there, and then it's pretty much, you just get it in. And if it works, it works. And if you don't, you might have to go and touch it up. You might have to scrape it off.
But on that, you just say, you wouldn't put that in necessarily. If you're working in the studio, you would wait till the layer below is dry, so that goes on easily, and you would rest your arm onto something so the line is...
Well, that's good, thank you.
Yeah.
So if you're wanting a straight line, you could get a straight edge, and then you get the brush, and you just go right along the straight edge. And you don't want to go going like this, getting it thick and thin, because try to keep the weight the same, and you just go right along like that, and you can get a straight edge. And it depends, if you're painting plein air and you want to paint it now, you could sort of drag a thin line for a telephone line in there, and it'd work fine. If you're doing it in the studio, you could do it afterward when it's dry. So there's brushes. I think that was...
Kitty is asking about my Kitty cross. My favorite thing in the studio to look at, aside from your paintings, which is they're wondering if they could get a closer view, maybe that's not possible, of your drawings behind you.
Well, I'll tell you something. There are currently 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 things coming out of my computer making this go. Robert has done, I have to congratulate Robert on the job he did of technically making this thing work. I can't move the computer. But I tell you what, I'll make a slideshow. I'll just photograph most of them one day and make a slideshow somewhere.
I'll put it on Instagram.
So Danny's asking a question, plein air, he's saying it's hard to find something. Do I find it hard to something? And I say, yes, it is hard. And it takes a lot of walking around. You maybe have to come back a different time of day because this time of day isn't quite right. Need to be a little earlier or a little later. The location might be great, it might not. I might make notes to return here at like 4 o'clock on a Tuesday, on a sunny afternoon. But, I remember when I was playing more tennis, that I was taking lessons, and I was just so frustrated by this backhand, something was going wrong again. It was working great for a while, it was back again. I said, oh God. And he said, well, if it was easy, we'd all be Roger Federer, right? And it's kind of like that. Learning to paint, it's a wonderful big project, and it's worth the effort. This is why I'm saying this thing about deliberate practice. Because it's worth going in, digging into the places where you might see weaknesses in your work, and just working on that specifically. So then it's not something that you've figured it out. But it does take walking around, doing plein air things. And I tend now to do less of just going out there and hoping I'm going to find something now. I tend to do more reconnaissance than I used to do. and tend to try to line up the right time, the right day, because I don't like to rush, and I don't like to sort of find something just as it's kind of disappearing and trying to keep it in mind what was going on. I like to be there in advance of it, and then by the time it's just the way I like it, the way the light is moving or something, bang, I'm right there and I've got it under control. Now, Coco said something about she finds everything interesting, and how do I determine where the focal point is? So I want to show you a couple of slides because this is sort of interesting. This is, I have a big book of Soviet realist painting. And you might say in this is a narrative painting, obviously, but look at the interaction between the guy and the woman, and then notice that, oh, there's a guy behind who's just finishing his coffee or something, and a guy who's just leaving. So there's all kinds of things to look at here, right? But the painter is clearly orchestrating what he wants you to look at, because the relationship, even though the girl I don't think is looking at her, she will in a moment, and there's a very strong connection between those two, even though it passes right through that guy drinking's head. So, of course, there's all kinds of things that there are just fabulous and wonderful. But your job as an artist is to curate it. You're not out there trying to paint the world. You're trying to curate the world and tell us what interests you. So here's a painting in the Rijksmuseum of guild members. I can't remember. I think they're the Silversmiths Guild or something. And if you go to the Rijksmuseum in Amsterdam, you see these things. There's dozens and dozens of them, long. Some of them are just long. There's like 12 people in the guild, and they're all given absolutely equal weight right across. And every single one of those people would have been very happy, I imagine. Looks like me. We're all happy here. Now, The Night Watch by Rembrandt is also a guild painting. And that guy, the two guys in the foreground, I bet they're happy. But look at all those other people. They all paid 100 guilders to be part of this thing too. And they're, hey, what about me? Now, if we're looking at which is the better painting, we still talk about The Night Watch. All those other guild paintings are on the walls in the museum, but they're forgotten. So this is what I'm saying about your job is to curate the world. Your job is to figure out what interests me and what am I going to share? What am I sort of obsessed by in a way? And, you know, Sonia said something along the same idea, like I've got hundreds of ideas. How do I focus just on one thing? And that gets down in some ways to find an obsession. I don't mean like something weird obsession, but I mean, just think like Morandi painted bottles for 40 years. Degas painted ballet dancers and nightclubs, and Monet painted his water lilies in his garden. I mean, there are things that call to us, and we need to find them, because that's the only thing really that's going to separate you from other people, finding the thing that calls you and then developing the skills to actually give it, make it work. So here, we've been an hour and 5 minutes. And I'm on page 8 of 11 pages of notes, and you've been leaving questions, and I can go on. Okay, let me ask you. Should we just go on?
Some people are dropping off. Some people, like a shout out to anybody in Sri Lanka, Lebanon, Dubai, Argentina, South Africa,
Sri Lanka, Dubai. So listen,
Australia, in the middle of the night.
Wow.
Thank you for being here.
All of you. Listen, let's call it here. I'll ask you whether you thought this was a good idea, because now that we know how to do it, we can do it again, and I'm happy to do it. I love, being able to answer the questions. It feels a little bit more connective than just making videos alone here in the studio. So I was going to talk about abstraction and representational painting and commissions and some other things like that. But why don't we leave it there at slightly over an hour, and we'll just say, if I didn't get to your question, I'm sorry. And if we didn't get to your question in the chat, I'm sorry as well.
We'll figure out how.
But I think we have the chat.
We hope.
We hope we have the chat saved, and I can go through and we can just look at the questions that came in and maybe sort of consolidate them. So listen, if this seemed like a good idea, please let me know, and we can do it again, and I can just continue with this and some new questions, and we could do it once a month or something like that. So just let me know.
Someone suggested liking, if they didn't mind, liking this.
Oh, and do like it if you did. If you enjoyed this, do like it, because I don't know why. That probably does something to the algorithm. I don't know. So listen, I really enjoyed this. I hope you did. I hope it answered some questions and just gave a sense of information around everything. I thank Anne again for manning the chat, and for Robert again for getting everything organized. And as I say, we've got it all organized now, so we can do it again. I will see you on Tuesday, because I have this new, this 350 photographs I've edited down to one particular painting. Or actually it's going to be drawing, and then I'll paint it the following week. So I really enjoyed this. I hope you had a good time. It's going to be recorded, I hope, and then posted somehow. And we'll do it again. So have a fantastic Saturday. I'll see you Tuesday, and bye for now.
So cool. That is amazing.
So now, Robert,
Ian.
I need your help to get out.
I've fallen and I can't get up. Robert, you're amazing.
That's so cool. Goodbye, everyone. That was amazing. Ian, I don't know if you can see. Look at all those comments. That's so cool.